Welcome to this masterclass by OpenUp. We're delighted to have you here this afternoon. My name is Marjolein. I work here at OpenUp. And for everyone who is a little bit less familiar with OpenUp, we are on a mission to make mental well-being accessible for all. And one of the ways in which we're trying to do that is via these masterclasses, a very accessible way to learn more about the topic of mental well-being. Today's masterclass is specifically for managers. And not to immediately put in pressure, but that is so important because the impact you have as a manager on your team well-being is immense. Research has shown that as a manager you have a bigger impact on your team's well-being than, for example, their therapist. I'm personally also a manager, and what I find really challenging is that especially when there's a lot going on in the organization, stress, I'm stressed myself and I try to protect my team from that, I'm trying to filter that, is exactly when they will pick out the signals immediately and will be maybe even more worried because they see all these signals but I'm not saying anything. And that's exactly what the topic of today's masterclass is about. How can you be a role model yourself as a manager, and how can you use vulnerability effectively towards your team? The speaker of today is Jochem Buckman, one of our own psychologists. He's a great speaker, so I'm really looking forward. And the only thing for me then still to mention is that there will be a Q&A at the end of the session, and you can request some questions. So if you look at your screen on the bottom right, you see the chat. People have found that already, I see, that's great. And next to that you see a questions icon. There you can put in your own questions, but you can also upvote other questions and we will address these first. So that was it from my side, and I'll introduce you to Jochem.
All right, and also on my behalf, a very warm welcome to this masterclass, and thank you for this very nice introduction. So this is me, Jochem Buckman. If you're wondering how do you write that, that's what it looks like. Very delighted to be here as well to walk you through this topic, a very, very important one to me. And I'd like to start on a more personal note, because a couple of years ago when I wanted to work here at OpenUp, I was hired by my team lead, and she was absolutely a role model to me as well. Not because she's one of these people that always showed this sense of warmth and kindness and still has this hard-working attitude, right? So I kind of looked up to her as I had my first few weeks here, because she always seemed to have everything under control and still managed to sort of radiate warmth, right? So it was a particular Tuesday when we had a team meeting. And she steps into the meeting and she says, "Guys, we got to be honest. It's Tuesday, but I feel like it's a Friday afternoon. I'm exhausted." And then that was the first time I ever heard her say anything like that, right? We talked about mental well-being all the time, but never so personally. And then she said, maybe I just need to go home for a little bit. And that's what she did. She went home that same afternoon. And the next day she was back and she was just her old self again. But much more than all the conversations we had about well-being in the weeks that we were working, this was the moment that stuck by me. Somebody that actually showed that this was important to her and to the company. And that's how we started rolling. So very much, of course, connected to the topic of today. How do you foster this culture of well-being together? How can you role model this? And in that sense, it's a very interactive course today, or a very interactive masterclass, and I'd like to be able to inspire each other here. So when were you inspired by a leader as I was in my example here? Perhaps you can share that in the chat as well for us to learn from that. Could be a leader that you have right now, but also maybe the leader you had when you started out working for the first time. Either is possible. And the fun thing is that we're not looking for these huge examples. It's often in small behavior, just as in the example of my team lead here. I find that in working with many managers throughout the years, doing one-on-one sessions and doing group sessions, almost everybody usually has somebody that inspired them in the beginning. So feel free to share that in the chat. It's nice. I can already see some people typing here. We'll get back to that in a second. All right. As that rolls on, let's dive into what is today all about. What are we going to talk about for a bit? Well, today is very much a two-part masterclass. In the first part here, I'd like to dive into starting with yourself, and in the second part, we'd like to dive in a little bit more into vulnerable leadership or leading with vulnerability. And of course the two are very much connected. Seeing some first examples come in. Similar experiences as me, prioritizing mental health, really good. During COVID lockdown, we were encouraged to take breaks during the daylight. Very good. That is a great example as well. That sort of we were not meant to stay indoors all day. Maybe get out every once in a while. Very good. And some vulnerability there already. Nice. Great examples. Thanks everybody. So let's dive into it. Let's start with ourselves for a little bit. This is very important, and I think to zoom out a little bit more, why is it important to have this culture of more well-being in the first place? Well, it has everything to do with some of these numbers that we did want to start out with, right? Nearly 90% of employees faced at least one mental health challenge in the past year alone. This is a huge topic for many people. Related, the WHO estimates that about a quarter of all people worldwide going to experience severe mental health complaints in their lifetime, right? It is a big topic. As a manager, similar to what Marjolein already said in her introduction here, you have a huge influence on it. And when asked, some people report that their manager has even higher influence than their spouse or their therapist or anybody that supports them. And it can be even up to 70% of the impact being reported as to do with your manager, your leadership style. And the last thing we want to do is add more pressure here, right? Because we see this as well. Like 64% of managers have considered quitting a job for better support for their well-being. There are so many indications that managers themselves struggle as well. And that makes it very logical to us to start there, to start with ourselves, to have these moments where we can check in with ourselves and have a bit of a mirror in front of us. But it's not always easy. I know it isn't for me, at least, to have these moments, right? Because you've probably heard that before. It's important to check in and start with yourself. But how do you actually do that, right? How do you know how I'm doing right now? Well, one of the things I'm using really often with my clients and also for my personal life is to put it into a more easy 3-step model, because it's easier to think about and easier to talk about. And I'd call that the traffic light model. So the traffic light model consists of, as a normal traffic light, green, yellow and red signals. And it's a way to get a grip on our own stress signals and how they could look. All right, so take for instance, if we were to start at the bottom here at green stress signals, what does that mean? Well, to me that means that I actually feel rather good. I feel energized, I feel active. There's definitely some muscle tension and energy in my body, and I also usually sense that my there's a lot of thoughts going on, right? Usually are in my case, but they still feel structured. They don't feel rushed. They feel like I feel excitement about doing many different things. So I feel generally good and energized and happy. It's still, I would still label it stressed, but in a positive way, right? Then, and this is what I always tend to do because it's usually easier, it's good to look at the red light signals. So what are the moments, because it means the same as in traffic, when should you really stop? And can we get to know what signals those are for us? So it's, to me, it's not just a little tension, it's a lot of tension. Usually translates into a lot of back pain for me personally. It means that my mind is everywhere, it's chaotic. And it means that I get angry about little things. I find myself screaming at my cat for no particular reason. The cat shows the same behavior, it's probably me, right? But the key here is not these two. We often know that. We often know when we feel alright and we often know when we should probably stop. The key here is the middle one, orange. Do we know when we're heading towards red? Because this is where we'd like to interfere, right? For me personally, I've got to know over the years that this is when I just get a little bit more irritated, when I get more snappy. And one of the biggest ones for me is when I lose some sort of joy. Like, am I still enjoying what I'm doing? I can still do my work, but I'm not getting much out of it anymore. So it's one of these signals that I should probably do something. Which brings us to the last one here. What actions can we take per level? For green lights, which usually is what am I doing that's working for me? For red lights, how do I stop? What do I need then? And for orange lights, what do I need to get back to green is the question that we do every time. I'm seeing, by the way, in the meantime, that people keep sharing experiences here, which is great. It's really, really nice. This is how we inspire each other. And on the notion of inspiring each other, I'd be very curious about the people listening to this, wherever you are, to share some of your signals. When you're perhaps in red or in orange, and you're feeling this is when stress is becoming too much for me. Perhaps we can get some inspiration from each other. And as people are sharing that, I wanted to also share some signals that we're seeing really often. And I'm doing that for dual reasons. Not just for yourself and to be able to check in, should I maybe take some action here, but also because these signals are often to some extent seen, or you can't see them in your team members as well. So the common signals that people are struggling, it doesn't mean there's anything that needs to happen right now, but there's definitely there's probably something going on here. All right, so the first one here is long-term exhaustion, sort of by which we mean that over time people keep saying, I'm just so tired, I'm just so tired, how are you doing, I'm just so tired, right? And also with these physical complaints, like in my case, my back starts acting up, so there's probably something going on, right? All right, there's often short-term sick leave. So that means that somebody's out for a day, comes back the next day, usually not really recharged, still working, week later, again off for a day. If this starts happening, if this becomes a pattern, definitely something to be mindful of. Seen, by the way, some signals being withdrawn is a very common one, actually, that's good. Yeah, not being to deal with unexpected events. That's a very good one. I actually have that myself too. Like I usually love change and variety and flexibility, but whenever I'm feeling more stressed, it becomes more, it becomes more difficult to deal with it. All right, so we also have reduced concentration, a lack of focus, forgetfulness, more mistake making. And this is often a really tough one, especially for managers, if you feel like you have to be the example of how to properly work, but you're stressed and because of your stress you're making mistakes. This is often where it becomes much more difficult to also acknowledge that. Not being fully present at meetings, which is this withdrawal, and this is sort of sitting there physically but not being there mentally. Or working many over hours, definitely one of my pitfalls, to just compensate, I'll just work a little bit more. You know? I saw a guy recently who said a little bit more is very dangerous. It's never a little bit more, is it? And this last one is one that is really differs per person, right? Sort of having emotional reactions isn't necessarily a bad thing, but we're looking from deviations of the norm. So if you're normally a very sort of calm, rational person, you never talk about emotions, and all of a sudden you have this outburst of sadness or anger, probably something to check in on. Vice versa, if you're normally very expressive and emotional and you share everything and all of a sudden you stop doing that, also signals. So that's really the key there, to look from deviations of what we would consider normal. Nice. Oh, very good. Sylvia adding here, getting cynical. Yeah, very good. Harder to remain hope or have faith in what we're doing is definitely one of them here. All right, so this brings us to how do we recharge then? How do we get to a light lower? How do we get from red to orange, from orange to green? And this is again something where we can inspire each other on. How do you recharge? What are your ways of recharging? You know, for me, it's I think some of the normal things. I think it helps to go on a walk every now and again. I find it really comforting to sit on my couch for a few hours reading a book. But to me also, it's working on I have a hobby in which I work on old cars, and this is also where I really find some recharging time to just work on something with my own hands, not being so cognitively preoccupied the entire time, is really something that helps me recharge. So I'm curious about your ways to recharge too. If we have some signals, perhaps we can help each other out here too on how do you now recharge. Nice. Seeing some people already say cardio, yeah. Especially if you're if you're in the same streak that you get angry as you get more stressed, cardio seems to really help to wind that down a little bit. Nice. Going for a ride helps. Meditation, of course, very good. Playing guitar, yeah. Music, creativity. What I like about your answers is that I'm seeing the two most important things to both have in coping. It's on the one hand, it's a passive relaxation or recharging, by which we mean just laying back for a bit, or perhaps watching Netflix, or doing just being there for a bit, right? And at the other hand, active coping, by which we mean here active recharging, such as doing these hobbies, such as puzzles or biking or cardio or travel, all these things. And it's important to be aware of, because it's not always easy to notice when, and it's not always easy to notice when we should go into action there. But most importantly here, which would actually be the step that could be connected to, is it time for me to recharge, is this notion of self-compassion. And it's an incredibly important topic to us, because having self-compassion, being sort of kind, which I would define as being kind and wise to yourself, is usually not the normal route. You can imagine if you're one of your team members would come to you and say, you know, I'm a little bit stressed and I know I have this deadline coming up, but I don't feel great. I hope that the normal response isn't suck it up, keep going. Luckily, for most managers that I speak to, this is not something they would say, but this is often what I hear people say to themselves. The way that they tend to treat themselves, you know, oh, I'm stressed, but you know, I'm the manager, I should be able to fix it, therefore let's move on. And we move away from that. And this is something that's called perspective taking, this ability to use a similar approach you would to other people with some wisdom and kindness to approach this to yourself too. Give yourself a moment to sit there and be with that. In a similar light, something that helped me personally a lot, which is something that my partner actually helped me with, was whenever something comes my way, what do you ask yourself? And I tended to ask myself, can I do this? Can I do it? And being a bit of a stubborn person, the answer is usually yes, even though maybe it's not warranted, right? So I start running. And maybe the question is, should I do this? Is this something that I should do right now? And it can help to frame things differently for yourself and perhaps take a more self-compassionate route. And even if you don't want to be kinder to yourself just for the sake of being kinder to yourself, I think it's good to note there that there's a lot of research showing that if we're practicing more self-compassion, it tends to translate into more compassion for others as well, which is key in getting this different culture and getting more of a mental well-being culture that's going on. It helps here, I saw a meditation and breathing already in there. Some breathing helps here to train yourself to be more compassionate so you can show it to others as well. Which I think brings us to the second part of this masterclass. If we're able to help ourselves out a little bit, to be more compassionate, to be mindful of when are we struggling ourselves, then we can start going into leading with vulnerability ourselves. Which is something that a couple of years ago, long before I had any words for any of this, I faced. I was at this point, I was building an internal academy for a large international organization. I was very young still, and a lot needed to happen. I was very much in my can-do mentality, right? So I was on a 9-day streak of training. Every day, early mornings, full days, prepping the next training days, 9 days in a row, because that's the way I did it back then, right? And day 10, I wake up and my back is absolutely killing me. I feel horrible, I feel drained, but here the stubbornness comes back, right? So I decide to get out of bed anyways. I was sleeping on this location. And I go into the training room and I still managed to set the entire room, get the slides ready, everything was in order. And I was supposed to do the day together with 2 other people. And they come in and I was about to already sort of go into my task mode, right? Sort of, oh, we still need to fix this and this and this. But I took a moment, I'm still very happy I took that moment. And I said to them, guys, gotta be honest with you, I don't feel good. In fact, I feel completely awful and I don't know what to do. And they didn't hesitate for a second. They said, we know what you should do. I think you should go home and rest and we got this. And I had a hard time believing that they got that. But I decided to go along. I did go home that day myself. And didn't feel great initially because I was feeling home and I felt guilty about leaving them behind. But I went to the doctor and they found 6 very large knots in my back, which were all stress-induced. And I learned there. That's where my limit was. And much more importantly, I learned that it is good to let go every now and again, trust on these other people. But mostly I learned in the weeks afterwards that they kept referring back to it because they had that experience. They were apparently looking to me for the sort of what is a normal rhythm and pace here, and I was pushing them for an absolutely unnormal rhythm and pace. And after that, they felt much more comfortable in sharing with me as well in my leadership position at the time. Which brings us to the definition of that, right? What is vulnerable leadership or leading with vulnerability? It's when leaders communicate their own experiences to team members in which they were uncomfortable in any way, or when they were emotionally hurt. Discomfort is the key there. And it's a process of sharing this, in normalizing this, in basically saying, you know, I'm human too. So it's a very important thing, right? To do this. I think this is one of the most fundamental things when it comes to providing more of a well-being culture. But this is not necessarily status quo. I'm finding again and again through my work, right? So I'm curious, why isn't this happening? And according to you, what are some reasons for you not to be vulnerable before we dive into why we could be? Because this is what I'm finding again and again and again, right? It's not normal necessarily to do it. What is that for you, for the people at home? Do you ever notice yourself holding yourself back, not showing this vulnerability, even though you may feel like you want to? And then why is it? Nice, yeah. Shame and regret afterwards, I see Josephine say, I see Maria. Expectations from you. Lack of psychological safety, I will get back to that in a minute. Expectations, perfectionism, yeah. Seen as weak, yeah. This is one of the these are the common ones that I keep getting back to there, is as a leader, I should be strong, often undefined what strong is in this case, and I should be able to do this. And this should is where a lot of it goes wrong, or where it's hard to do this. A lot of perfectionism here as well. This is exactly it. We have this image that we should not be having this, but you know, here we are. And it's this makes it really difficult to do. Often this stereotypical image of a leader being unmovable, where again, we are only human. And the cool thing is, it doesn't tend to work out that way. Because a lot of this research is showing that why would you do it? Why would you lead with some vulnerability? And we'll go a bit more into how to practically do it later. Why would you do it? Because it tends to make more connections on the emotional level. And we're seeing so much research emerging right now that it's not, and not just right now, they're very old too, is that what makes people work harder and feel more comfortable and do better in teams is feeling connected, is having sort of an emotional connection with people. Then the second one is that it tends to create more trust, that we can build on each other because we're seen as, hey, we're human, we can do this together, right? And it definitely enhances psychological safety, which we'll get into a little bit more. Before doing that though, it'd be good to mention here the psychological safety, right? The shared belief by members of a team that it's safe for interpersonal risk taking, right? Is this a place where I can share, where I can take risk, where I can make mistakes? Something that I used to say also in our group sessions is this is a psychologically safe place. We can share here. We can, yeah, it's safe. And then at some point a participant said, that's not up to you. And I was puzzled by that. What do you mean that's not up to you? But then I realized this person was right and we had a bit of a conversation about it. It's a deeply subjective experience. We cannot decide for somebody else whether or not they're safe. All we can do is set the boundary conditions for that. We can share ourselves, we can try to sort of at least phrase it, we'll get into some more practical things, but it's good to mention, even though we feel safe, it doesn't necessarily mean that the other person is safe. And it's a huge topic. And this was highlighted by a study done by Google some time ago. They were interested in what makes teams function, right? How do we get the best performing teams out there? So they went to work, they did this very large scale qualitative, quantitative, meaning interviews and data of 180 teams, of their own teams. And they looked into, is it personalities, is it team composition, what is it, right? Is it how much impact they can make, how much meaning they get out of their work? What is it that makes these teams function so well? And the number one there was teams which rated high on psychological safety did best. So not just on a sort of, they not only reported higher mental well-being, they also just performed better. A very interesting find because I don't think I would have expected it to be number one, but it was. Zooming in a bit more into that research, there was actually two things that came out that created this psychological safety a little bit more. And it was that these teams had equality in the distribution of conversational turn-taking. By which we mean it's not this classic image of leaders that take up the entire space of the meeting and then maybe two other people say something. They seem to really share the conversational space, which was productive there. And it's a higher than average social sensitivity. They did check in more with each other. How are you doing? What are you dealing with now? And also notice that sort of, hey, you seem a little bit off. Are you okay? Do we need to make some space for this? Were some of the things that they saw in these teams that rated very high on psychological safety. See, there's something that coming in here. Nice. I'm very happy to see Katarina's comment here, that it takes time, absolutely, to show this empathy. It's not there immediately, but it does emerge over time. Absolutely, that's very cool. Yeah. Which is actually very much the next question as well. So Katarina was way ahead of us, right? How have you fostered psychological safety in your own team? Also here, perhaps we can inspire each other. What are some of the ways that, before I, of course, share some of our ways that work for you? What have you already tried when it comes to fostering more psychological safety? Very curious what happens here. I'm seeing Dennis making something that is actually funny, not biting. It tends to help. Very good, Dennis. One of my own examples that I saw the other week was I was working with a leader, and we had a general team meeting, a check-in, and he decided to share a story of the week before where he just messed up completely. And I won't go into the detail what exactly he messed up, but what I liked about it, that he didn't do this thing where he said, and this is what I learned from it, and therefore I am now better, or whatever. It was just the mistake itself. And I think that's a very important thing, that whenever we're sharing mistakes, that we're doing that from a source of, it was just a mistake, that's also all right. We're not forced to improve immediately. Mistakes can just be there and be just a mistake before moving on. Nice. Sharing openly, share personal things, some positivity. Very good. Very good. I like that one. I didn't see the name there, but just cancel a meeting if you're having a one-on-one and take some time to do it whilst walking, for instance. Don't do it online always, but just maybe see if that fosters it a little bit more. It's very good. Go on topic that affect you and then go, well, yeah, very good. All right, which brings us to some of our practical tips near the end of this masterclass already. And I'm seeing this everywhere, share these personal stories. I try to do this as well, and I think it's fundamental here to do that. And I'm often finding myself emphasizing that as a leader, there is going to be a dynamic here. Because in this case, if you have a leader and a team member, one decides over the contract of the other person, and that does not go vice versa. That means that there's always going to be, however small, a little bit of an imbalance. And by sharing these personal stories, you can see if you can level those out a little bit. It's probably you that has to make the first move. And that doesn't always feel right, I know that. But it makes sense. For the other person, it's just more on the line. A big one there, as in the example I just gave, is to admit self-doubt and struggles. To say, I also don't know the way out of here. I have faith that we'll make it, but I don't know right now. I'm having struggles here too. I'm thinking about this route, but I'm not exactly sure yet. Brings us to the third one here, is to be more open and to ask for feedback. By which I mean, and this is something that I hear really often from managers, especially working with young professionals, is that they're saying, my door is always open. If you want to, you can just walk in. You know that, right? My door is always open. Perhaps you've had a manager that said that as well. But it doesn't seem to work, right? It's not like they're walking in all the time, often. And it's the same power dynamic, the importance of being able to not only open the door, but to step out of it, to actively reach out to people, because it's going to help. It's absolutely going to help. The door open is usually already such a high threshold to get over before we get there, that it may help if you make that little step over the threshold instead of the other person. When it comes to asking for feedback, I think that's one of the best things of showing that you care as a leader. I want to know how I'm doing. Do not expect that you already do everything greatly. I saw some perfectionism pop by in the chat here. This is exactly what it is about. To be open. I am not actually perfect. I'm trying to be maybe, but I'm not, and I'd like you to hear where I can improve. And the last one here is to be more consciously vulnerable. And we did wanted to emphasize this because we can acknowledge that it's not always, it may not always be the moment or the time to be super vulnerable. If you've had a very intense, weekend, you've had fights with your partner, somebody passed away, and you're in your team meeting, and it's a lot for you. If you start, you're going to talk for half an hour straight. maybe that's not the place. But maybe you can say, I'm going through some things at home. I don't need to share it right now. I'll share it as it comes up. Just know that I'll be a bit distracted. You're already showing a little bit of vulnerability without taking up the entire space. And I can acknowledge this is the hardest thing to do, to be, when am I using this? Because I think as a leader, you can use vulnerability to help others. But once we get to the point where you're becoming a therapist, or better yet, when the other person is becoming a therapist for you, I think this is the point where we should question, is this still the way we want to go? So to be more consciously vulnerable was the key there, right? All right, so today, in conclusion to this, I cannot stress this enough how important it is to take care of ourselves here, to start there. What is my traffic light? What am I going to do whenever that happens? How can I help myself there? Is it just to schedule those in my agenda every now and again, perhaps do some more breathing exercises, or go for a walk every now and then, whatever that may be. Only then, if we're checked in with ourselves with some compassion, we can help to others to be more vulnerable as well, to go into this mode of vulnerable leadership by role modeling this. If you're at the end of this and you're sitting, I need more examples, or I need more help with this, a throwaway tip here is to get inspired by others. Look for people who can be a role model to you. Either your own company, have a chat, or maybe out there in the world, and be curious. What are they doing that helps to role model? So bring that to the end of today's masterclass before the Q&A. I think if you do all of this, you can become the leader that you needed back when you started. Thank you very much. Let's dive into the Q&A. I'm very curious for your questions.
Hey, thanks, Jochem.
You're very welcome.
I think really such an interesting concept that you think with vulnerability you're burdening the team, but actually you're almost doing the opposite. I find that really interesting, and I'm also immediately very self-reflective. Am I doing the right things with my teams? Do I check in enough? And that also brings me to my own personal question, and that will be for people who are maybe not a psychologist and this doesn't come as naturally. Yeah. What are questions that you can ask? What is a good starting point?
Right. So I think the big one here is maybe not always start with a question. I think this sort of start with a story, somehow you're doing, and that people tend to follow that. I'm seeing that in the group work that I do as well. That's sort of whatever story the first person tells, the rest sort of tends to latch on. So if the first person, like, how are you doing? Oh, my weekend was okay. Then the next in line will also talk about their weekend. Yeah. So sometimes as a leader, you can say sort of, wow, it's been an intense week lately, and we barely got the deadlines. I definitely had to put in some extra hours last week, so I'm feeling a bit, yeah, definitely felt overwhelmed last week. Okay now, but how are you guys doing? Is a way to introduce the level that you expect from them as well. So you're role modeling, or you're mirroring what you want to see there. More practically, you can also vary in what kind of questions you're asking, right? So how are you doing today is very broad. It's a good question, but you can't expect broad answers. If you're really interested in how is your sort of mental well-being doing right now as we're talking, we sometimes use a little bit of humor. So I was working in a team where we did what is your internal weather report was the thing there, and it really helped. It made it a bit more light. And then somebody said, very shiny day today, the sun is out, I feel great internally, right? And the other was like, oh no, it's a storm going on, I feel very stressed. And it was fine, and we could laugh about both. So it's ways to sort of vary what kind of questions do we ask. Yeah.
Not make it too big.
Yeah, make that smaller. Yeah, because again, it's very normal that people are not feeling great all the time. That's fine. It doesn't mean that there's something very large happening. It just means that I'm not doing great right now, and that's okay.
Yeah. It's really good advice. I always feel, you should start with asking questions, but it's a good point that maybe if it doesn't come naturally to you, that also for a team member, it's even harder to start sharing their own personal stories, and then making that very first step yourself is a way to lower the threshold almost. Yeah, that's the idea. Yeah. Anna is asking, what if our managers or co-workers are not a role model for well-being, but the working area pushes us also to the opposite of well-being? Yeah, so a high stress environment is what I'm hearing. That's what I think, yeah. One of the most paradoxical and annoying things I think about stress is this tendency that as it builds, we get more narrow-minded,
right? So whereas usually the opposite is necessary here.
Yeah.
So if we keep focusing on the task at hand, then we tend to lose what else is happening, our general well-being. So I think the key there is to make that a thing itself. Could we stop for a second and check in how we're doing it, not just what we're doing, but the way that we're addressing all of these things. So that's sort of, and I think this is where leadership comes into, especially for other team members, say, this is the line, this is where I'm drawing it, this is not going to be functioning anymore. When it comes to people on the same level as you, on the leadership level, that are not showing that, I think that the only thing we can do is to, again, role model ourselves, but to have that be part of the conversation, especially if this is affecting your team members, right? Yeah. When it comes to coworkers, one-on-one talk on that. And I think it's good to not push that person itself, be question why, right? Sometimes people are being unpleasant, to use a kind word here, because they're not doing well themselves. So I didn't put it in the list here, but it is usually a big marker of unwell-being when we're being so grumpy or so nasty to other people, and it's not pretty, but it's usually, again, compassion there.
Yeah.
Even though, again, I acknowledge it's counterintuitive, but I think that's where it is.
Yeah, it's so hard, this kind of spiral, and then how to get out of it.
Yeah.
And then you need to be almost like an adult yourself to be able to level it up again. Yeah, and there also, again, sort of this notion, you probably don't have to actually do all of this by yourself. Yeah.
But perhaps you can get some support there too.
Yeah.
If you have a manager, get them involved.
Yeah, and I don't know if the question of Anna was meant like this, but what I strongly recognize, at least, is that sometimes it is indeed a high pressure time, and you have deadlines that you're running towards, and at the same time you want to be there for your team, but you might not always, at least you think you might not always have the time in the 30 minutes check-in that you have with your team member to go in depth on how somebody's really feeling. You also just, want, okay, we have to discuss ABC and
we got some things to do here.
Yeah, exactly. How do you balance that?
So first off, it's very recognizable. Like especially in the field that I'm working, we're all very concerned with how we're doing, right? So so I know I recognize it. Like I had the other day, we're sort of, hey, how are you doing? And before we knew it, we're like 20 minutes of half an hour meeting was gone. And then we really had to, and then that created stress, right? What we've done nowadays with a team that I'm working with, and it works for us, is instead of doing the how are you question or the sort of let's check in or whatever, we're asking, are there any personal distractions? So something that's keeping you from being able to function in this meeting. Yeah. And that's really short. Because if the answer is yes, then I think it's warranted. Give some time to it. It's not going to work anyways, otherwise. Yeah. But really often this is no personal distractions, and you have showed interest and attention, and you can just move on. Yeah. Because that's usually the function, right, for the check-in. You just want to know, can we move on? Are we not passing anything? Yeah. Or that. Yeah.
But then you already need kind of the psychological safety that you will know people will flag if they...
absolutely. So this is one of these things where I think it's good to take the broader perspective. This is not going to change in one meeting or with one thing, but this is what we build over time, right? Yeah. Building trust isn't something we just do. It's this repeated, predictable actions that we see leaders do. That's when we trust them. Yeah. You said you would do this and you did it. Great. Yeah. I believe you.
Point. Monica's asking... interesting point, actually. It's quite difficult to be vulnerable as a woman in an environment which is male dominated. Right. The gender prejudice is there in any case, even with very open-minded people. What would you suggest?
Absolutely a painful one for me, because I think this is also what I'm seeing in studies, that this is still there, right? And I think the prevailing, when I've worked with a female manager, the prevailing limiting belief is this one, the sort of, I'll be seen as too emotional or weak, or there is another woman that would say these things. Well, first off, I think it's good to mention that a lot of these things are, luckily, mostly there in a limiting belief sense. That sort of when we try, that usually we find, maybe not the first time, but after 2 or 3 times, the backlash isn't as big anymore. Secondly, we can acknowledge that whenever it's happening. And I think to borrow from some of that other sort of more maybe even masculine energy, but to mention that sort of, if you're not taking me seriously when I'm showing an emotion, that's a very hard line there. Yeah. That's not something that I think we should ever cross. Yeah. I would personally, if I were to, and of course I can't fully answer this because I'm not a woman myself, but I do know I have been in situations where I try to open up or be vulnerable with somebody and had sort of a laughing response back. I get angry at that point.
Yeah.
Like I'm not going to interact with people that just respond in a cynical way or sweep that under the carpet or not acknowledge it at the very least. And I think that's all right.
Yeah.
I think we can set boundaries there if we want this, if it's acknowledged that this is a place that we want to go towards, and that this is where we can set some boundaries. And also, but I think mostly, and this is not necessarily just for female leaders or male leaders, this is a process, right? This is the first time we're going to do this, you're going to feel discomfort within yourself, and you're probably going to feel discomfort with your team members. That's normal, that's new, and we should experience some discomfort. And over time, we become better at managing that discomfort.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a really good advice. Like, don't stop to be vulnerable because it will make yourself and your team more effective.
Yeah.
But do have your boundaries if you notice people respond cynical or because that also makes you strong in a certain way, like having your boundaries, being clear about them, being able to make them explicit.
To know for yourself where that line is, and to acknowledge that sort of what the hard thing about this is, psychological safety and sort of being vulnerable is a positive spiral that we get in, and it also works the other way around. So where do you break it? And it tends to be broken at the individual behavioral level, right? A culture is something that emerges when a group of people are together. Mm-hmm. So it's a bunch of individuals interacting. Yeah. So there's many ways of it that it can change, but one way is usually that some person decides, I'm going to do things differently. Mm-hmm. And then usually people start to follow. Yeah.
Again, about role modeling.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe even also about checking your assumptions, because now I'm making it very personal, but sometimes I also realize I'm being then really cautious about being very open and vulnerable, because I think people will see me as weak and female. But once I also checked this with my manager, and that was completely not the case. So it's also more kind of my own reflection of a culture that's there, rather than maybe it actually being the culture around you.
Yeah. So that's always good to check, and this tends to be true. Yeah.
Natalia asks, how open can a manager be so as not to overdo it and lose authority? Because as you already said, there is, of course, also this relationship. There is
I wouldn't be too afraid of losing authority too much, but I think there is just a point where it's not serving a purpose anymore beyond you sharing. Yeah. And I think that's the balance that we're looking for. Am I still doing this for also the benefit of my team, or is it just purely because I need to let this all go? Mm-hmm. If you have a team of 8 people, should I now have a session of 30 minutes with 8 people? Maybe not. Maybe that's something I can do with somebody that I feel trusted and secure with. So it's a time thing, and it's a sort of how much space do we want to take up here thing. And it's when you feel it's more about this is now more a sort of therapy session for me, that's probably where the line is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But on the other hand, if you feel like my team is picking up the stress anyhow, it's probably the moment to at least be transparent.
Yeah, you want to be ahead of that. So sort of, it's one of these things where we can really trust our gut. So if we're feeling a little bit nervous, this usually means that the rest of your team is also feeling something there. Acknowledge that I'm definitely a little bit nervous or tense or stressed out or irritated because of this customer. I don't know. It helps.
Yeah. Joanna asks, what if my manager and some other people work during their time off while telling everyone we shouldn't do it? Very recognizable. Or they work until late hours. I feel guilty when I see such behaviors, or when I want to leave at 5 p.m. as the only one.
Yeah. So when you're seeing people over or underwork, or mostly overwork.
I think it's more about, saying all the time it's really important that we leave at 5 and we shouldn't overdo it, but at the same time doing it themselves, clearly also showing that by sending emails, Slack messages, whatever.
All right, this is a bit of a cheat, but it works. On things like Slack and email and all of you have delayed responses, which is actually something that I've used because I didn't want to signal that I was working on something at 9, even though I was. And I just sent delayed messages. So then people get a message at 9 in the morning. None is the wiser. Yeah. On a very practical level. Whether or not that feels good to you is entirely up to you. But I think this is exactly what I mean. This is the sort of, if we really value people only working within office hours, then we should too as leaders. Yeah. To the more strict variant, or acknowledge that you're doing it and why. Mm-hmm. Because I more on a personal note, the way that I work, I do really enjoy taking at least an hour and a half, a few nights a month, where I have the time to not be distracted and really work on something. Like, well, honestly, I made parts of this masterclass in evening hours. I love working then, right? There's nothing wrong with it per se.
Yeah.
But when I'm communicating at that point, I do always preface it with sort of, I really don't expect you to answer this now. If you're even reading this, don't. It's not the deal we made. Let's get back to this tomorrow, but I wanted to send it already. So you can preface it a little bit, and at least you're acknowledging that it's a deviation from a norm you set yourself.
Yeah, but at least being very reflective of the signals again you're sending. The last question by Adeline. Being a manager means sometimes, to me, also to be a poker face, welcoming team frustration, and at the same time being not always aligned with management decisions, but not being allowed to show this to my team. How to show vulnerability in this case? So it's really about, you sometimes also, are almost a messenger of a narrative that you might not back up yourself.
Yeah. How do you do that, right?
How do you do that? Yeah.
Well, I think forcing people to say something they don't believe themselves is something. But again, I've characterized myself as a stubborn person. I wouldn't necessarily do that. But I do acknowledge that sometimes things happen that I don't agree with, and then that's what I do. I wouldn't sort of go all cynical, but I said I have some doubts about this too. But as in my role here, this is the message that I'm going to bring across, and I'm. Like I said, I also have some doubts here and there. I'd be open to share them if you really want to hear, but I'm also open to hearing yours.
Yeah.
So then you're still being truthful, because that's, I don't know, I hold that very dearly when I'm working together with people, and you're doing your job, which is to convey that message.
Yeah.
That's what I would do.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe even kind of disagree and commit. I don't agree to what you're saying.
But we're still going to do it.
But we are going to do it.
Because this is part of teamwork, right? I mean, one of these things, I didn't mention it in this Google study, is also they're highlighting that conflict can exist in a team. Yeah. That's fine. You don't actually have to agree. Yeah. At some point, you're just going to move. And that's fine.
Very clear. Hey, thank you very much, Jochem, for the great talk. Thanks also all to you. I want to emphasize two things. Firstly, it's good to know we also have intimate group sessions for managers specifically, where you can share your reflections a bit more, really learn from each other, go more in depth into what's going on with you. And secondly, we are really curious to learn what is your number one takeaway from this session. So here an invitation to think about that and to write it in the chat and share it with us. Thank you very much and have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much.